Welcome, everybody. My name is Robert Siefkin. Today, I'm going to be discussing an extraordinary period in the history of Mexico, commonly referred to as the era of the Reform. It was a transitional and very transformational time that took place in Mexico from 1855 up into about the year 1876. Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has declared that his country is in what he calls the fourth transformation of its history. The first transformation was Mexico becoming an independent nation in the year 1821. The second was what we're going to talk about today, the era of reform from 1855 to about 1876. The third transformation was the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. And then, of course, he's claiming that Mexico is currently in its fourth transformation. So today I'm going to be covering, as the first of three episodes, the so-called second transformation, the era of the reform. The reforms that took place during this time in Mexican history included the separation of church and state. This is enormously important. Land issues as they affected the Indians and the church. The secularization of civil functions like marriages, funerals, and burials, and so on, which had been before administered and controlled by the Mexican church. The era of the reform was tumultuous. It resulted in several important reform laws, a new constitution, the Constitution of 1857. This constitution, by the way, is referred to by allegory on the image on the slide. Then Mexico had to go through not one but two back-to-back civil wars. After that, and along with that, the invasion and occupation of Mexico, much of Mexico, from 1862 to 1867. And during this time, in 1864, the installation of a European emperor. Well, by 1867, the French had left Mexico. The emperor, Emperor Maximilian of Austria, had been captured, executed, and the imperial effort or experiment came to an end. To better understand this time of Mexico's history, the reform, I think it's useful to give a recap of life in Mexico starting from its independence in 1821 up until the beginning of the reform, which actually can be seen as 1854. Well, here's a good quote from historian Richard Nathan Sinkin that I think gives a good summary. Quote, prior to this great period, traditionally called the Reform, Mexico was barely a nation. Having achieved a shaky independence in the 1820s, Mexico's existence wavered constantly, and many doubted that it would survive the century. For 34 years, the country lacked order and stability. Governments came and went like the tides. Constitutions were written and rewritten with machine like regularity. Local political bosses thwarted all attempts to create a workable national government. The Catholic Church dominated both the economic and political activities of most Mexicans, and foreign nations preyed upon the defenseless Mexicans in successful attempts to dismember the nation. By mid century, Mexico's plight seemed hopeless. Everything had gone wrong, and the early post independence optimism had given way to a crushing despair. End quote. Now, during this era of the reform, different laws were enacted, which were viewed by many in the church as anti clerical or anti church. So, what was it about the church in the early years that caused these liberal reformers so much concern? The Roman Apostolic Catholic religion, according to Mexico's own constitution, was the only show in town. It was the only religion to be tolerated in Mexico. Now, there was an advantage. One advantage of this was it acted as the connective tissue to all demographics in Mexican society. The church was also the main source of charity for the poor, a major employer, and they acted like a kind of a national bank. They were a very important source of financing and lending to Mexicans in general. And during the 300 years of Mexico having been under colonial rule, of Spain, so that was 1521 to 1821, the church had become firmly entrenched in the lives of the Mexican population. So by the time Mexico got its independence in 1821, if you were a Mexican, it was for the most part assumed you were Roman Catholic. An exception to this, though, was a certain portion of the Indian population that was doing its best to hold on to their own particular religious ways. But there was more than one disadvantage to all of this church influence. First, the church pretty quickly started to gain an enormous amount of power, influence, and privilege. The church was beholden to a European leader, Pope, and not so much beholden or loyal to Mexico and its own government. So this meant the church impeded nation building within Mexico, which in turn made Mexico look weak and made it weak, and much more of a target for some foreign nations to try to take advantage of them. A classic example of this was the very aggressive land hunger and expansionist program of their next door neighbor to the north, us, the United States. As well, the exclusion of all the other religions meant that highly qualified individuals from other countries who were not Catholic but could be of benefit to Mexico would either choose not to immigrate there, or if they did, they felt compelled to hide their religion, practice their beliefs in secret, and live in certain fear they might be found out and oppressed or persecuted. Mexican conservatives in general felt that supporting the church was essential to Mexico's cohesiveness and sense of morality. Many, perhaps most liberals, didn't look at it that way. So even though the great majority of liberals themselves were Catholic, it was the institution of the church, not Catholicism or the religion, but the institution of the church and its enormous power that they, the liberals, took issue with, and they felt secularization would result in much improved nation building. In other words, much more national unity and national loyalty, as well as a much better economy. Now, this was a time of turmoil, chaos, and upheaval. This means there really wasn't any black or white to the era reform, but rather a lot of gray areas and changing conditions, sometimes very quickly. Well, it wasn't just the church that caused liberal reformers concern, though. Mexico's economy suffered during its war for independence against Spain, which took place from 1810 to 1821, so 11 years. For example, the mining industry, which once was a very significant source of revenue, declined sharply as miners joined the war or they fled from the violence. So, with the departure of these workers, the mines deteriorated, filling with water, timber rotting, shafts collapsing, machinery rusting. And despite attempts by foreign companies, especially England and the United States, to intervene in Mexico's mining industry, their efforts were largely unsuccessful. So, as a result, a key driver of Mexico's economy and employment became unproductive in the aftermath of the War for Independence. 500,000 lives were lost. That many people died during the War for Independence, so there was a shortage of labor. Mexico had virtually no railroad system to transport goods and people, and because of its rugged and regionalized geography and no real system of good roads, getting from one place to another was an ordeal. Traveling merchants were taxed. They were taxed over and over and over again. Each state within Mexico levied a tax on merchandise that these traveling merchants had to sell, with taxes ranging from 3 to 12% of the worth of the goods. And also, in some states, you got taxed within the state as you went from district to district. So once you did actually finally get to your final destination to sell your stuff, guess what? You then got hit with around a 5% sales tax. So, with all these layers of taxation, which were a main source of government revenue for states, these taxes stayed in place for a very long time. Now, look at this map. Mexico is enormously mountainous and hilly. In fact, about 70% of the territory in Mexico is mountainous or hilly. One mountain range, as you can see, runs along the west coast, another mountain range along the east coast, and another one across the south. Unlike the United States, not many rivers there are large or deep, and they are not well interconnected. So, this, of course, drastically reduces river transportation of goods and people as an option. These are some important factors that led to regional isolation and social/cultural compartmentalization in Mexico. In other words, regions were geographically separated from each other, so this led to more of a sense of regional identities as opposed to national unity. Farming, agriculture in Mexico after independence in 1821, especially the cultivation of corn, was the main economic activity. But just about all farming production was for subsistence, just for your own family subsistence needs, but not a surplus for sale. Now, had surplus crops actually been cultivated, they would have been sold and taxed. This would have stimulated the economy and provided government revenue to, in turn, help out the people of Mexico. Primitive farming techniques were resulted in extremely low productivity, and even those crops that were sold commercially experienced very limited markets. A substantial lack of industrialization also contributed to a stagnant economy. Literacy or illiteracy in any country is considered an important social ill. So, those who are illiterate are seriously limited in opportunities, including employment and the ability to better their station in life. Believe it or not, in early Mexico, the illiteracy rate is thought to have been as bad or as high as 99%. So this was yet another aspect of society the liberal reformers felt strongly had to be changed and it had to be improved. By the mid 1850s, a certain group of up and coming mestizo is a combination of indigenous blood and some other ethnicity. Um, a certain group of up and coming mestizo intellectual liberals started forming plans to try to correct all these problems, stimulate the economy, and start in on some serious nation building. The word mestizo, as I mentioned, by the way, is an ethnic description of those with mixed European and indigenous American ancestry. Okay, so here's some more background. I hope this helps to explain what led up to this era of the reform. In early 1846, we have to step back. The United States provoked a war against its much weaker neighbor to the south, Mexico. This was the Mexican American War. This war was started mostly in the interest of American land hunger and expansionism. Here's what historian Kenneth C. Davis had to say about this war in his book called Everything You Need to Know About American History But Never Learned. Quote, if you thought Vietnam was a nasty little war, you should have seen the Mexican War. For the first time in America's short history, the nation didn't go to war with a foreign power over independence, foreign provocation, or global politics. It was a war fought unapologetically for territorial expansionism. End quote. Now, the war started in 1846. It ended in February of 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. As a result, Mexico lost, get this, they lost half of their country, half of their territory to us, the United States. Um, this territory is what is now the modern day southwestern United States. Now, Mexico was paid by us $15 million and some other compensation for reparations. The loss of this enormous amount of territory, half their country, was a national dismemberment, if you will. This brought an awareness to both liberals and conservatives in Mexico as to the why of their having lost this war to us. The country was not politically, geographically, or culturally unified, and it wasn't militarily or financially capable of waging a war. In other words, there wasn't much of a sense of national unity, and Mexico was, in fact, weak. Mexico also understood all too well and very much feared the still ongoing and almost insatiable hunger of the United States for more and more land, and knew serious changes were needed in Mexico to fend off possible further attacks by the so-called Colossus to the north, the United States. So, both liberals and conservatives had the same fears about the future, but they saw the direction Mexico should take in very, very different ways. By the year 1853, the conservatives had found a way and a guy to institute their agenda, which consisted of centralization, authoritarianism, and autocratic rule. The guy I'm referring to is somebody you probably have heard of, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who decided his official title, by the way, needed to be His Most Serene Highness. So, not much ego going on there, am I right? Okay, so from 1853 to 1855, Santa Anna, His Most Serene Highness, the dictator, got so carried away with his power that over time, even a lot of conservatives were starting to wonder why they put this guy in office. It took some liberals of that same period of time, though, to have this autocrat, Santa Anna, removed from office and kicked out of the country. So in early 1854, a group in the southwestern coastal state of Guerrero began the so-called Revolution of Ayutla. The main goal of this revolution was to kick Santa Anna out of office. It also put forth ideals which later on would be incorporated into Mexico's new constitution of 1857. Now, the revolution was successful, and for somewhat a brief period of time, one of its instigators, a man named Juan Alvarez, he's the guy on the far right on this slide, became president of Mexico. So this revolution in 1854, this can be seen as the very beginning, the very start of the liberal era of the reform. But who were these reformers? One historian describes them geographically as mostly coming from the so-called liberal circle. I've outlined or put a line showing the liberal circle on this image, on this PowerPoint with red highlighter. By the way, the core area of the conservatives are highlighted in green on this slide. So this consisted mostly of the cities of Mexico City, Puebla, Querétaro, Toluca, and Pachuca. So they, the liberals, were mostly composed of those who were born and raised during Mexico's War for Independence from 1810 to 21 or after that. Some of the key leaders of the movement had been exiled to the United States when Santa Anna the dictator was in power. So this led these exiles, these liberal exiles, led them to feel a great deal of resentment. It also gave them numerous opportunities to get together, a meeting of the minds about Mexico's future once they were able to go back. So these exiled liberals included Benito Juárez, who later on became Mexico's president for about 14 years. Also, a man named Melchor Ocampo, who was going to serve as the Minister of the Interior of the liberal government. Ponciano Arriaga, who became one of the main authors of this Constitution of 1857, a liberal secular constitution, and a man named Jose Maria Mata. Also, up until this time, the Creole population. What's a Creole? A Creole is those of pure Spanish blood, but they were born in Mexico. So, up until this time, the Creoles had mostly been in control of the country. But this new liberal breed was made up mostly of mestizos. So, there was not only a political shift in the making here, there was also an ethnic shift to it. Also, the great majority of these new liberals were lawyers, soldiers, bureaucrats, and journalists. So by the time 1855 rolled around, this group of liberals felt very strongly it was time to create some new laws to implement their ideas and initiatives. But what were the principal aims or goals of the reform and the reformers? Here are some general goals, each of which I'll go into later as we go on in this presentation. But I'll just give you kind of a general overview. Okay, so first they wanted equal justice under the law. What's meant by that? Well, amazingly, up until this time, Mexico had not one, not two, but three separate courts systems. They had the civil system, they had a separate court system for the military, and another separate court system for the church. So, in other words, depending on who you were, you would go to a different court system and you were not going to be treated the same. Like I've said, they wanted to secularize Mexico. They wanted to separate church and state. And this even went to the point of where it became invasive on the part of the government. They wanted to suppress monasteries, secularize clergy that were living in them. They wanted to abolish brotherhoods. They saw these as a threat, and people who were loyal to their brotherhoods were more loyal to the brotherhood than they were to the Mexican government. They even went so far as wanting to abolish allowing newcomers into convents. So, through a process of attrition, these convents would probably just start to disappear. And they wanted to nationalize the wealth of secular and regular clergy. Again, I'll go into more detail later on. Some more of the goals of the reform laws: they wanted to eliminate the civil or life cycle event fees. So, in other words, these include birth, marriage, death, and funeral rights. The church had been in charge of administering these rights, but they charged a fee no matter if you couldn't, even if you couldn't afford them. They knew Mexico's economy was stagnant. Something had to be done to try to mobilize or stimulate the economy. They wanted to get rid of domestic passports. So if you were a Mexican living at this time, you had to have paperwork to go from here to there. So they wanted to get rid of that. That felt like an infringement upon liberty. So they wanted liberty to just be able to travel. Better domestic security. They'd been defeated by the United States, who had taken half of their country. Also in 1838, they had been invaded by the French for a short period of time. So they wanted better domestic protection. And they wanted to get rid of court fees. If you go to court, you shouldn't have to pay a fee just to be there. And finally, like I've said before, they wanted to engage in nation building. This was inspired especially by the defeat to the Americans in the Mexican American War. So I do want to point out, though, an obvious inconsistency, maybe even a hypocrisy here is the liberal reformers claimed they wanted separation of church and state, but they wanted to implement measures restricting or abolishing practices that were strictly religious in nature. So, in my just own personal opinion, the government had no business involving itself in those kinds of church affairs. And it's beyond me how this group of professionals and intellectuals either didn't see the inconsistency there or they just decided to ignore it. Now, I mentioned there was a series of reform laws, liberal reforms. The first among these was called the Juárez Law, known in Mexico as Ley Juárez. And it was issued on November 23rd of 1855, so late 1855. It was named after a man, Benito Juárez, who at the time was the Minister of Justice and Ecclesiastical Affairs in the new liberal government. Now, Benito Juarez, as I've said before, would later become president of Mexico for about 14 years, starting in 1858. This law, just so you know, was more formally known as the Law of the Administration of Justice. Now, by far, the most controversial aspect of Ley Juarez was the partial suppression of what were known as fueros. Now, I put that word on the slide so you know what it looks like, fueros. Fueros in Mexico were judicial systems that were outside of the regular civil courts. Fueros existed for the church and a separate fueros for the military. So, what this meant in practice is clerics and those in the military were exempted from the regular civil courts and instead had their own court system. In our modern day, just so I can maybe try to explain a little bit better about what these fueros were, here's a comparison. In our modern day United States, we have something similar to this in the military. It's called the military court martial. We even have a separate military prison facility called Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. So I hope that maybe gives you a little bit better idea about what fueros were. Not surprisingly, these fueros were seen as special privileges because procedures and penalties within them could easily be misused or abused to let perpetrators get off lightly or maybe get off entirely. So as opposed to the regular civil courts. So in other words, for the liberals, these fueros represented a lack of equality under the law. But in a conciliatory way, Ley Juarez only partially suppressed the fueros. Now keep in mind that in society you have both civil and criminal offenses. This law allowed the church and military to keep their jurisdiction over criminal charges, criminal offenses, but jurisdiction over civil offenses was taken away from them and transferred to the regular civil courts. This law is also seen as a first step to try to separate church and state and to secularize the rule of law or just the rule of Mexico. Now, you might think the church and military would understandably be unhappy about this change, but maybe not all that upset or even outraged, right? Nope, that's not what happened. The fueros had been around for a very, very long time, even before Mexico got its independence back in 1821. So this meant these fueros were or had become an integral part of the workings of the church and military, and so for the government to take away even part of their jurisdiction was met with great offense, hostility, threats, and even violence. To the liberals, though, the fueros were seen as loyalty to an institution, loyalty to the institution of the church and of the military, above and beyond loyalty to Mexico, the nation. Liberals were intent on nation building, and they felt that fueros ran contrary to a sense of solidarity throughout the country. So, when I hinted at the outrage expressed by the church and military, what was involved in all that? Not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'd at least like to give an overview of the reaction against Ley Juarez. So here we go. It happened very quickly. The bishop of the southwestern Pacific coastal state of Michoacan lodged an adamant protest within just 1 week of the issuance of this law. He saw the law as governmental interference, and he was worried that clerical abuses would now be brought into the public light, which would endanger public morals, and it would also lower respect for the clergy. Now, soon to follow after that was a conspiracy to depose Mexico's president at that time, someone I mentioned before, Juan Alvarez. That conspiracy failed, but President Alvarez was soon replaced by a more politically moderate and conciliatory Ignacio Comonfort. In Puebla, which is just southeast of Mexico City, there was a serious revolt, which was started under the banner of religion and fueros. So, in other words, we want to keep our religion and our fueros. This revolt, too, was unsuccessful, but suppression of the revolt cost the Mexican government more than $1 million. So, the government, in turn, appropriated church property to recover the cost of shutting down that rebellion. That didn't sit well with the church either. But likely the most important action taken by the church was this. The church threatened something very important and very serious. They threatened the withholding of blessed sacraments for those who abided by this new law, which in turn meant eternal damnation. So, in addition, the church refused to bury anybody who abided by this law, refused to bury them in sacred ground. They refused to take confessions or perform marriages, all of which made matters for them even worse. Now, here's a quote from historian Robert Knowlton describing the catch-22 that Mexican citizens found themselves forced into. Quote, there were legions of common, ordinary citizens caught in the gigantic clash of the temporal and the spiritual powers of the land. Both demanded the allegiance of the people. The former punished them if they did not obey governmental decrees. The latter damned them, threatened them with far greater punishment beyond this life if they did obey. End quote. Now, I mentioned the church threatening to withhold the blessed sacraments for those abiding by this new law, Ley Juarez, and in fact, it pertained to all three of the reform laws that I'll be covering. Well, there's another side to the story involving bad acts on the part of the liberal reformers, most of which took place after the year 1861. This involved leading liberals using axes to destroy altars, church facades, and pulpits. Images of saints were decapitated, shot full of holes, or burned in public. Church treasuries were robbed, church libraries were set on fire and their archives destroyed. Bishops were stoned to death, some of them. Lifelong nuns were forced out of their convents, and there was the expulsion of all but two bishops out of Mexico, with one leading liberal proclaiming, well, they should just all be hanged. Ley Juárez, as I mentioned, would be the first of three laws that ultimately, later on in 1858, would lead to a 3-year civil war between the liberals and the conservatives. The next of these laws was called Ley Lerdo, better known as the Lerdo Law, better known in Mexico as Ley Lerdo. But we'll cover that law in the next episode, along with more events of importance that took place during this era of the reform. Until then, have a great day and que tengan un buen día.